Hello, everyone. So, I know, I kind of for the last class was a bit of a mess, but let's just go over what we know so far. So, what do we leave off on? Does anyone remember?
Something.
World War One.
World War One, exactly. Now,
Right.
what? Just
Alcohol
World War One?
stuff.
And
stuff.
like the industrial something. I don't remember.
Alcohol stuff.
The 1920s,
I
right?
need to connect your head.
Prohibition and all that stuff. You guys remember?
Oh, the Depression?
Yeah, the Great Depression and the
Oh,
Prohibition.
that
having
was not
alcohol.
good.
Pardon?
Last class, a big giant talk.
Yeah, last class, my Wi-Fi literally died on me. So, yeah, that was. I'm sorry about that.
Your
No
what
bueno.
literally what on you? Your what literally what
no
on you?
bueno. The
My
Wi-Fi go
Wi-Fi
boom boom.
died. It literally died. Like I didn't
Yeah.
have any Wi-Fi.
It just
so
go boom boom.
I literally couldn't take the class.
Your what died?
My Wi-Fi died. I didn't have any Wi-Fi.
Haha, very funny.
Well,
Dad.
believe it or not, but so yeah, Great Depression. What do you guys remember specifically?
People started drinking. People didn't want to work. Stock crashed.
They wanted to
Okay,
be
I wanted to explain
miserable
this to
because
you
they
last
were
time before we were cut
miserable.
off, but do any of you guys know what the stock market is?
It's where you buy parts of a company, and every time the company makes money, you get a part of it. Part of the
Exactly.
money
Exactly. That's right.
considered to your like stocks.
That's right. That's right. But do you know another way of how your stock gains value? Your stock gains value when your company makes money. But do you know there's another way for your company for your stock to gain value?
When there aren't that many stocks.
That's actually the opposite. When there are not that many stocks,
yeah.
your stock drops in value. Well,
yeah,
when there
there
are
are
not
lots.
that many stocks, actually, yes, your stock raises in value. But if there's not that many people buying it, it drops in value. So it works the other way around. If your stock has a lot of people who want to buy it, it gains value. Do you know how that you guys see how that works?
Yeah, it's like the more people buy it, the more you get money from, because the money that they pay goes to your company.
It's not just that. It also works like this. Let's say this company stock is worth $10, okay? It's worth $10. But let's say Justin also wants the stock and he's willing to pay $15 for it. And now the stock is worth $15 because he's willing to pay $15. But let's say Camille really wants the stock more than he does, and she's willing to pay $20.
That's like bidding, right?
Yes, stocks is basically bidding. The more people want it, the more it's worth. But see, this is the thing. Your company has to make money for the stocks to be actually worth more. So when the stock prices are really high, but the company isn't actually making that much money, there's a problem. And that's exactly why the economy crashed in 1929. Stocks were worth this, but the companies themselves were actually only worth, say, this. You know what I mean? The stock itself, just the actual value of it, like just judged on based on how much the company costs, was only $10. But people were paying up to $50 for $10 stocks. You guys see how that works? So then the stock market works on confidence. You have to be confident that the company will succeed, or else you wouldn't buy their stocks. So you can't be confident forever. You grow a bit nervous. You say, hey, this company might not go so well. Since the stocks are so high anyways, I'll sell some of it. And then your friend sees, and let's say, Justin, you sell some of your stock to get some money. Camille sees that and says, hey, that's a good idea. This can't go on forever. And then Camille sells some. And then everyone sees you two sell and they start selling. Soon enough,
Oh.
everybody is selling, and then this market crashes because everyone's selling and no one's buying. You guys see how that works?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is there anyone who still doesn't understand how this thing works? Bear in mind, this is very oversimplified. So you all understand roughly how that works? All right, I'll start up my presentation for World War II. Give me a sec. Okay, so because we didn't do anything last class, this is going to be a slightly longer class. We're going to cover a bit about the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War in one video, so bear with me. Now, we go to the Dust Bowl. So, do you guys know what the Dust Bowl is?
Kind of when everyone was fighting each other, maybe?
No, that's World War II. Do you know does anyone know what the Dust Bowl is? It's really fine if you don't. It's a pretty specific piece of history. No, not a problem. So basically, the Dust Bowl is when the soil and okay. The soil and farming states were depleted. See, do you guys know how this happens? Why your soil isn't worth as much? How it's depleted, as I said. So basically, farmers back then were not very educated people. They didn't understand ecology. Now, basically, they plowed the soil very deep, which displaces grass and with very deep roots. So the thing is, that grass that they plowed out of the soil, it holds onto soil and it traps moisture. Now guess what happens if your farmland doesn't have any soil or moisture?
Crops
can't-
die and you can't replant them.
You can't grow things and you can't sell them to make money.
Exactly. That's actually exactly what happened. So think about it. You're in the prairie. There's lots of grass, right? You're an uneducated farmer. You say, let's just get rid of all that grass and plant our crops. But the thing is, your crops, they don't have roots as deep or as old as the grass roots. You pull out all the grass roots. Now your soil doesn't trap any moisture, and it's also very, very loose. If it's loose and it's dry, it becomes dust. Dust, there's no moisture, there's no nutrients, you can't plant anything in it.
Why
See,
not
the
just
soil-
add water?
Pardon?
Why not just add like 100, like why not just like get a whole pail of water and dump it there?
A pail's not going to be enough. That's going to cover and also the
It's not
grass
just-
roots are going to feed on the water too.
It's not just that.
Pressure water blaster that is connected to the ocean.
That's
First
salt
of all-
water.
But they didn't have technology back then.
First of all, yes,
And
you're
that's
all
salt
correct.
water too.
That's first of all, ocean water is salt water. Second of all, this is happening in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. They're literally in the middle of America. There's not much water there, first of all. Second of all, I said these people, they're not very rich. They're also not very educated. They wouldn't know how to do that. Second, even if they had pumped water from a lake, It's not enough water. This is massive, massive, massive amounts of land. Millions of square miles. Millions of square miles of land. What just dumping? There's most lakes simply don't have the water capacity to do that. And the most important thing is the dirt is very, very loose. Harvey, what do you have to say? You don't need to raise hands, just shout it out.
So actually, I forgot.
It's fine. So Harvey, basically think of it this way. You can pour water into the soil, but the soil is loose. It's extremely loose. It's also very dry. See, the soil is only like the, do you guys know what like a cross section of the earth looks like? There's the crust, the
Yeah, there's
mantle,
the
and the core, and
crust.
all that
Then,
stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah. Soil is
crust
just
is
the
mostly
very,
stone.
just the very, very, very bit over it. See, when you pour water, the water goes down. Do you know how that works? Do you guys see how that works? The water goes
Yeah.
down. It sinks into the soil. There are no roots to hold it up. So the water dries out, and then you have to dump in more water. But there isn't that much water. So the soil dries up and you get dust storms. So, and also think about it. These farmers, they're very poor people.
They can't
And most
afford
of them,
much.
they don't even own the farms they work on, or they have massive mortgages. What do you think happens?
They can't pay their debts
Exactly, they can't pay their
and their
debts.
taxes, and then they're homeless.
Exactly, that's exactly what happens. When you can't pay your mortgage, pay the mortgage on your house, the bank kicks you off the land. A lot of them, they don't even own the land. They just work on, they've just been here for many generations, and they just say, hey, we've been here for many years, this land should be ours, but they got kicked out. Also, there were more efficient methods of farming that were adopted, such as using tractors. Before, people literally pulled the plow with horses or cows.
Why not
Not
just
very,
cacti? I heard
pardon?
cacti a lot of water, and then cut
Yeah,
the
but no one's gonna buy cacti.
that be a good idea? Because cacti don't need a lot of water.
But no one's buying cacti. They need
Yeah,
food.
the thing is, yes,
They're not
that's
rich enough to buy it.
that's not the thing. First of
Useless.
all, cacti, it doesn't have much value. What can you do with a cactus? Can you eat it? Yes, but there's much more valuable thing. There's just much more valuable things to plant. The second thing is like the cactuses you see in like those old Western movies, they're over 200 years old. Like the
What?
massive ones are taller than you, they're 200 years old, like more than 200 years old.
Also, if a cacti was taller than me, it would only be 100 years old.
Around
Well,
100 years old, because I
yeah.
don't know how tall you are. So yeah, planting cacti is not no one wants to buy it. That's a big problem. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Just throw it on the ground and forget about it.
But
That's
why buy
exactly
the
what these
seeds
farmers
then?
did. This is exactly what these farmers did. They planted their crops, forgot about their crops, and then this is what happens. So all in all, people were losing, all the farmers together were losing $25 million a day. One day, $25 million in one day, which is $460 million today. Think about how devastating this is. $460 million in one day. Just let that sink in a bit. So think about it. All these farmers, they have no money at all. They have no homes. They have no backup plan.
They
They're
should just
No, nothing.
go doing
they're
no
quite
more.
honestly screwed. So they turned to crime simply because they were desperate. So
And
as you know,
crime is no
simply
good.
because there were no options, crime, God, I can't spell, skyrocketed. I really can't spell, Jesus. So yes. Now, I told you why farmers were starting to turn to crime a bit. So can you tell me any other people who might?
The people that relied on taxes that farmer paid.
The
The
people that
people that
speak a
want
bit clearly.
alcohol.
Justin, did you say something? I didn't quite hear it.
Maybe like the landowners that rely on the farmers' taxes.
No, see, they're land owners. If they're rich enough to own the land, most of them are fine. That's the thing.
The people who want alcohol.
The people who drank it or sold it.
Drink it.
No, well, the people who drank it, most of them, they were always that poor, so they didn't really feel desperate. They turn to small crime like robbing shops and stuff. They don't do any big stuff like this guy on the PowerPoint here. Here, I'll tell you. Basically, factory workers, some of them turn to crime. Think about it this way. You're working at a factory. Your boss can't hire you anymore because his factory isn't making any money. So you get laid off. You can't go home because you can't pay the rent to your landlord. Your family has to go with you and find somewhere cheaper to live. But you literally can't afford anything because everything's too expensive.
And every
What do
time
you
you
do?
move, it costs more.
You do crime and rob shops and stuff.
Most of them, they join the gang. They join the mafia. Do you guys know what the mafia is?
Yeah.
Like people that just rob people and stuff.
Not just
Like-
that. The thing about the mafia, they operate like this. Basically, they control a section of the city, and that's basically they can choose to ask the people who live there for protection fees. Do you guys know how that works?
You pay us and we don't rob you or kill you.
So if you
Yes,
don't,
if someone tries to rob you and kill you, we will protect you. That's how protection fees work.
and
Or
I
they
might-
might not actually protect you, but it depends on how honorable your mafia is. Yes, Harvey, what were you going to say?
so it's basically like money and I'll protect you. If you don't give me money, well, bad idea.
We'll beat you up and kill you, basically. But if someone from the opposite mafia, if someone from the mafia in the other town tries to attack you, we will protect you. Most of them will do that. Some of them probably don't, because it depends on how big and how honorable the mafia is, because they have this big obsession with being honorable. They don't want to be associated with the ordinary criminals who just rob people for money. So yeah, that's basically what a mafia is. So also, what do you think, what were the crimes they committed to make money?
Forcing people to forcing people to give their money.
Robbery? They did some of that. What else?
Well, not particularly robbery. You could say it's like you know what, if you have an iPhone,
They didn't have technology back then.
hello, this is from the legal department for those things. They'll try to rob your money. That if like that.
Yes, I know. Robbery is one of the biggest ones. Is there any other ones you guys can think of? How about prohibition? That guy wants to drink. He can't afford the good he can't go to the store and buy alcohol. How does he get alcohol?
He makes it himself.
Steal
He
it.
makes himself, or he buys it from who?
From bootleggers.
Exactly, bootlegging. So do you guys know how bootlegging actually works? It's basically it's all connected to the mafias again. I'm sorry. Basically, a guy just in his home or in a shop makes the alcohol. A guy with a car takes the alcohol to a pub or a store, and then people go to the pub or the store to buy and drink the alcohol. That's basically how bootlegging works. First of all, it's extremely illegal because, first of all, it's illegal to make alcohol. Second of all, doing work for a gang, like transporting alcohol for the mafia, very illegal. Basically, all that. But the thing is, the prohibition was over in 1933. So in 1933, you can go and buy alcohol and drink however you want. So once the prohibition is now over, how do these people make money? Think about it. All these people are poor. They need money. But some of them they're not that desperate. They think, hey, if I get a loan, I might be able to survive this time, and then I might be able to get a job or something else later on. So banks won't lend to these people. They're very high risk. There's a very low chance they'll return the loans. So what do you think will happen?
They steal it.
Theft is one, but here's another one. Have you guys heard of loan sharking?
Loan watching?
Loan
sharking.
sharking. Loan sharking. Have you guys heard of it?
Like kind of just getting a loan and then like fleeing the state or something before you pay it back.
It's fine if you guys don't know. It's really not. It's not something you learn very early on. Basically,
Loan shark.
it's a loan. You give people who the banks won't give loans. Think about it. Like that homeless man who wants a loan to get a job. No bank will lend to that. But say you give the homeless man a loan with very, very high interest rates. If he can't pay the loan back, because you're a mafia, you go and you threaten this guy. You force him to pay the loan, or you just kill him or sell or do something like that. That's basically what loan sharking is. They also did labor racketeering. Do you guys know what that is?
Labor whatting?
Racketeering.
So just like labor strikes.
Kind of like that. So in the 1920s, the unions were starting to grow big. Do you know what unions are?
It's like a group of workers that form a group. Yes. And then
Yeah,
they do
basically.
things.
Why do they form a group? What is the group's purpose?
To help each other.
Basically, stuff like that. They're saying like, if our employers don't treat us this way, we'll quit our jobs. If we all quit, the employer has no workers, so the employer has to listen to us. That's basically what a labor union is. Labor racketeering is doing business with these unions, putting your own people in these unions. See, if you control the unions, you don't only control the workers, you also control the factory owners, because you can force them to make demands. Let's say your mafia is in a difficult situation. You really need, say, $1 million. You can tell your workers to strike. You can tell your friends at the labor unions, hey, tell the factory owner to give us $1 million, or else all these workers tell them to strike. That's basically what labor racketeering is.
What is strike?
Pardon? What is what?
Is the strike like getting fired?
Or
It's
just
like
attacking.
just no, it's kind of like not going to work, I guess, maybe.
It's literally just not going to work. Thing
So
is,
they
if
can't-
one worker strikes, there's no point. He can be replaced. But if every worker in your factory striked, you have to I'm sorry, you have to appease them. You have to say, hey, come back to work because we literally don't have any more workers. That's the thing. That's how labor gains its power. Everybody does it or nobody does it. That's how labor unions worked early on because the workers were treated pretty badly. And of course, the 1930s were the crime started going down after the economy slowly improved. So back to isolationism. Who remembers what this word means?
What? Oh, isolationism.
Like
That was just
don't
like
take part and just like
isolating
Isolate.
yourself, just staying away, I guess.
Yes, staying away from European conflicts. So after people saw how horrifying World War I was, isolationism, of course, is very powerful. So how many troops did Americans lose in World War I? It's a pretty specific number. It's fine if you guys don't know. They lost 50,000 people. Now, that's a lot of people, but compared to the European countries who lost literally millions, it's not that much. But still a lot. And the Americans didn't feel they got anything out of it. See, to the French, they were happy, even though they lost so many people, because they were able to embarrass Germany again. See, Germany, France, Britain, they have this relationship where they keep trying to one up each other, but with brutal wars. Basically, around 50 beat France really badly, really embarrassingly in a big war. And then 50 years before that war, France beat Germany. And it goes back quite a couple of years. So, yeah, France was pretty happy because they were able to beat Germany again. England was happy because France was not a big empire anymore. They didn't have much power. And Germany was obviously very unhappy. So, because that's literally the reason they started World War II for. They were the Treaty of Versailles was way too oppressive. Also, the isolationism. The Americans refused to do anything except to sell weapons to the Allies because they sympathized for the Allies. This was until Pearl Harbor. See, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So can anyone tell me, just recap what happened at Pearl Harbor?
They bombed the harbor with Japanese airplanes. They
Who bombed
sunk the Arizona, and then they damaged a bunch of other ships, and a bunch of civilians and soldiers got injured.
That's basically
And
what happened.
It was the first direct attack against American forces.
Exactly. So the fact that, see, if Japan declared war on America already and then they attacked, I mean, the effect would
They're
be
allowed.
same. But the effect would be the same, but the thing is,
America could prepare.
what Japan wanted was they wanted to attack all
Quickly
the
eliminate.
Yeah, they wanted to basically eliminate the American Navy. See, this is what happens. I'll go over it in a video later on. But what happens was in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in this area, Japan wanted to invade it because they wanted natural resources. But it was very
My grandma
heavily
lives in the
colonized by Britain in America. The thing is,
grandma lives in the Philippines.
That's interesting. She might have some experience with this kind of stuff if she's old enough. So basically what happened was they really wanted to invade this area.
And then she came.
Yeah. So what they really wanted to do was they wanted to invade this area, but because they were all little islands, you need a big navy. The Japanese Navy they can't do anything against the British and the American Navy. Because Britain was already very occupied with Germany, with the Battle of Britain and all that, they said, hey, Britain probably isn't that much of a threat. Let's take out America first. So they thought this is basically what Pearl Harbor was. They wanted to destroy all their ships. But the problem was they didn't destroy any of the fuel reserves or the naval repair yards or the submarine base. So let's be honest. Pearl Harbor, it wasn't that much. The damage of Pearl Harbor itself wasn't what made it so horrifying. What was horrifying was because there was no declaration of war. America never technically legally did anything to provoke Japan. So it's safe the thing was 2,000 people died. A lot of them were soldiers and a couple of them were civilians too. It's safe to say that just because of this one event, America joined World War II. I'll show you guys the videos about World War II. Give me a sec. And the obligatory ads. Oh God, wait. More ads.
This video was made possible by Skillshare, an online learning community. Stick around until the end of the video to learn how you can get an exclusive deal just for oversimplified viewers.
I can't hear it a lot.
Basically, you guys don't really need to know what happened in part 1. It really didn't have anything to do with America.
I can't hear anything.
This video was made possible.
You can't hear anything? You can't hear anything?
No, I can't. I can hear.
An online learning community.
Can you hear now?
Stick around until the end of the video to learn how you can get an exclusive deal just for oversimplified viewers. So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns.
Okay, the quality, I can't stream high quality stuff, I'm sorry. Yeah? You raise your hand? What do you have to say? You don't need to raise your hand. You just need to. You can just shout it out. What is it?
What is what?
Someone raised their hand.
Russell, what is what?
Yeah. I mean, you raised your hand, so I assumed you have something to say.
No.
Okay, it's fine then. I'm sorry. It doesn't like
On the
streaming.
Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed a defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even.
Okay, I swear to God, this thing is. I'm sorry, the quality is.
Well, then ask
have to
scientists will
stream.
put us for a better computer.
It's not the computer, it's the Wi-Fi, and I really can't do anything about the Wi-Fi.
We'll get better Wi-Fi. Tell your Wi-Fi internet person that your Wi-Fi is bad.
You want me to do that in the middle of class?
Together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude.
Well, if you can, you should.
I'm streaming on 360. What?
I just need to see the words.
The
subtitles?
subtitles don't work unless the video's going.
Yeah, that's the thing. Here, I'll make the font size bigger anyways. Yeah.
was put on full display. In the end, it forced the Finns to sue for peace. Then they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around.
Are you kidding me?
No bueno.
On much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa.
Yeah.
Like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans. And they all pledged their allegiance to.
Oh my god. This is on
Maybe delete
240.
other tabs.
Yeah, but the other tabs are very relevant.
Close the other tabs. Close
I have,
them
Do
my,
you
all.
I
have
have,
any
I have
other
my
like?
other videos on the other tabs. That's the
Do you
thing.
have any other like apps or something open?
Just shut your other
Nope.
tabs. All of them.
He can't,
Shut
because
all your other
otherwise he'll
tabs.
have to shut his slideshow and his other things.
Captured the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine. So he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly. He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe." And sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston. But you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic, including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pie creep. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pie creep." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pie creep and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room. Then they tried to make a Pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea.
Another ad because it's YouTube. I'm sorry, I can't control the ads.
Well, then don't watch on YouTube.
I can't
The
control
ad
the ads.
blocker.
Then don't watch on YouTube. Watch on somewhere else. That doesn't have
It's the
ads.
only website. No one else is watching.
It's really the only
anything else.
website.
But use
Maybe-
ad blocker then.
Ad blockers, I'm sorry.
Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey, that was pretty
My God, this is 144.
easy, so they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going. But a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out. With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand, and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No, keep going. But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine. Keep going. We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." "Perfectly normal. Keep going." Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest? And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon. In the meantime, though, the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them. For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward.
Another ad.
He switched up his strategy.
I am so sorry.
Comment
Have
here.
you ever struggled with writing a speech or a presentation? Brian,
Yellow stuff, you can just skip it in front of it. It works.
No, it'll still show the ad.
Yeah, no, it doesn't work. And it doesn't load enough for me to do that.
Wanted to
Yeah.
focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, No, you stay. The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They intended to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sent a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans, we'll do it your way. Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans, let's do it our way as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before, invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches.
I'm sorry. There's
Barrage
another
came
one.
as Allied
Another ad? Just skip the ads and cancel them.
You can't.
I really can't do anything about it. It's like they know I have a class and they keep cramming ads in.
Freedom Unlimited, you now earn 3% on dining, including takeout. Bon appetit. Bon appetit.
ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the
But
landing.
don't click the ads.
British had golden
Otherwise,
sword.
they're gonna be
You
like.
can't skip
moving
them.
on.
They have to be there.
Indians at
Well,
Judah. Men
don't
struggled
click
to
them.
resist the light, particularly at Omaha, where the Allied troops captured
Have
the
you
beaches.
watched YouTube without ads before?
Yes, actually.
Are you joking?
It's like a
Yes.
3-minute video.
They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allies entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and not just a trick. Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again." He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying, "Surrender or be annihilated." When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts. And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. Two of the Axis nations had been knocked out. One to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the U.S. ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki.
Bomb was the atom bomb.
People living there.
What? Pardon?
The bomb was called atom bomb. It's the
Yeah,
second.
it's the
The
A
A
bomb.
bomb. Yeah, they just
Atom bomb.
nicknamed it. They nicknamed it the
Atomic.
A bomb. Yeah.
It was a terrible fate, but for the Allies, it achieved their aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first. In its aftermath, two major superpowers with two very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the two of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one.
Oh, why is doing that? Seriously.
Videos.
So now can you guys guess what happens afterwards?
The Cold
Space
War.
race begins. They start putting bombs in Cuba. And then they start trying to blackmail and beat each other without actually fighting. And it's like
Exactly.
communist vs capitalist.
All
And they
right.
kind of like use puppets, as in like the Vietnam War and the Korean War.
Wow, you know a lot about this stuff. And of course, we got more ads because we have new video and
Is on the button. Push the button.
being happy. Oh my God. It's like they know I have a class and I can't be embarrassed, so they embarrass me.
I've decided that in order to sell more merch, I should do a face reveal of characters coming in the future. Link in the description down below. The year is 1917. Fighting rages on the Eastern Front of the First World War. Both Germany and Russia are on the brink of collapse. Soldier, I need you to bring me this man. Got it. No, sir. What? Oh, not Lenin. Lenin, the Russian communist. What? Why would I need a beetle? Lenin, the Russian communist. He was exiled to Switzerland. You know what? I'll do it myself.
Stuff they do outside because the
I only see the screen up.
Who wants to start a revolution? The Germans put Lenin on a train and sent him all the way back to Russia, hoping he and his mates would create an internal crisis. And create an internal crisis they did. The government was overthrown, and Lenin was in charge. He immediately pulled out of the First World War, made the country communist, started a 3-year-long civil war, got shot, broke the economy, caused a famine, and then he died. On his deathbed he said, "Hey man, tell whoever's in charge of giving people jobs not to let that jerk Stalin become the next leader." By the way, who did I put in charge of giving people jobs? That would be Stalin, sir. Stalin was a rising force in the Communist Party. He still had some opponents, but conveniently, all of them were arrested or disappeared. So that was lucky. And so Stalin took over. He implemented his 5-year plans, which transformed the country from an agriculture-based economy to an industrial one. And like Lenin before him, he reigned with terror. Anyone who dared criticize or oppose him would either be killed or left to rot in the horrendous Soviet work camps. Then a short man with a silly mustache tried to take over the world, punched the Russians all the way to Moscow, and then the Russians, with some help from their faithful ally, the Winter, punched them all the way back to Berlin. At this point, being allies, America, the UK, and the Union were good chums. They held a couple of conferences near the end of the war to decide what would happen next. Hey Stalin, after all your trials and tribulation, you must be pretty happy to be standing here in Berlin. Tsar Alexander made it all the way to Paris. Just give me a second. Hey man, I think something's up with Stalin. I know, right? What should we do? Shall I tell him about the bomb? Yeah, tell him about the bomb. That will scare him. So, we got this crazy new big A-bomb that can destroy an entire city in one go. Yes, my spies told me already. Oh wait, I meant to act surprised. Wow, that's amazing. He already knew. How? Am I sure I want to send nuclear secrets via unsecure public coffee shop Wi-Fi? Am I ever?
Yeah, sponsorships.
Use a VPN. And speaking of VPNs,
Yes.
if, like me, you take internet safety sanitizers with the world, even land, it works seamless month-free for atomic or ass.
Okay.
Then America dropped the A-bomb on Japan, and World War II officially came to an end. Hooray, we won! Okay, so now it's time to establish the New World Order. Stalin, you're in charge of Eastern Europe. Now, we want you to let them all hold elections. Oh yes, of course, elections. And these elections will be free and fair, right? Oh yes, certainly, free and fair. Definitely free and fair. Communist, 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 communist. If that's not free and fair, I don't know what is. Throughout Eastern Europe, Soviet puppet governments were established as a buffer zone between the USSR and the West, with Churchill proclaiming an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The relationship between the old allies was deteriorating fast. Over the next few years, the British intervened in the Greek Civil War to prevent a communist takeover. In Turkey, the Russians began demanding more control of Turkey's sea access routes, which prompted the US to send their largest battleship to Turkey for a friendly visit. After World War II, Iran was now occupied by both the Soviets and the British, with an agreement to both pull out once the war was over. The British pulled out. Stalin was like, you know what? I think I might stick around. All in favor of kicking Russia out of Iran? You want to know something? You guys suck. Pressure from the UN forced the Soviets to leave, and with the establishment of NATO, the Soviets had no doubt that the West was out to encircle and destroy them. And America announced the Truman Doctrine, in which they basically said, those guys are not cool, cannot be trusted, and we will do everything we can to prevent the spread of communism around the world. Many view this moment as the official declaration of the Cold War.
Dude.
I'll pause screen sharing just so you guys don't have to see the ad, but I'm sorry. You have to listen to it.
Sometimes it's in getting it all over the kitchen.
That's annoying.
Everyone was living in a post-apocalyptic void brought on by the Second World War. Cities reduced to rubble, not enough food. It was terrible. This is great. The more they suffer, the more likely it is they'll turn to communism. Dude, you're really messed up. What's wrong with you? My father used to punish me severely. America realized what was going on and quickly made a move. Under the Marshall Plan, they sent $12 billion to Western Europe for its economic recovery. The countries of Stalin's Eastern Bloc looked on with envy. Hey, Czechoslovakia, you want to come get some economic aid? Yeah, but I have to check with my mom first. Sorry, America. I can't come. This was a full-on economic battle raging between capitalism and communism in Europe. If the Western nations developed faster and better than the East, that would be a defeat for Stalin. So he set up his own rival economic recovery plan, which he called Comecon, and he also set up Common Form, which gave him more political control over the Eastern Bloc. But nowhere did this economic battle rage harder than in the city of Berlin. Caught over 100 miles behind Soviet lines, the city had been divided up between the Allies, and the western segments were still under Western control. East Berliners could travel freely to West Berlin, see the economic prosperity, and think, maybe this communism thing ain't so great after all. I'm gonna have fun tonight. You're home late. Oh, Stalin. I was just out with my friends. Friends? You stink of capitalism. You're out engaging in imperialist debauchery again. I swear, Ivan, I can't keep doing this. Stalin wanted the West out, so he said, hey, guess what? I'm blockading all of your supply routes to West Berlin. What are you going to do about it? I suppose we'll just fly the supplies in. All right, Truman. You win this round. The Berlin airlift was an incredible undertaking and a major success for the Western Allies, and Stalin ended his blockade of West Berlin. His aggressive actions worried the West, but not as much as this did. The Soviet Union had developed their very own atomic bomb. The USA no longer had a nuclear monopoly. The world now knew that if a major war broke out between the two superpowers, it would be more destructive than anyone could imagine. So it was comforting when Stalin came out and said that war between the Soviet Union and the West was unlikely. Oh, wait, inevitable. He said it was inevitable. Hey, you know who I haven't checked in on in a while? My good friend China. Whoa, what happened to you? What happened to them was a full-blown civil war that had been going on since 1927. The People's Liberation Army, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, successfully defeated the Republic of China, who fled to Taiwan. The now communist China and the Soviet Union signed a mutual defense treaty. This was terrible news for the West. But wait. There's more. After the Second World War, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. In the north, the Soviets set up a communist regime. In the south, America set up an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Korea under their own regime. Now that he had the bomb, Stalin was feeling a little more cocky, and he finally gave Kim permission to attack. The North launched a surprise invasion of the South on June 25, 1950. With Soviet aid, the North Koreans steamrolled through, taking Seoul in just 3 days and replacing one ruthless dictator with another. The UN were freaking out and quickly created an emergency force made up of troops from 16 countries to defend the South. The West still held Busan and made landings at Incheon near Seoul. They pushed the North Koreans out of Seoul, replacing the ruthless dictator that had replaced the first ruthless dictator with the same ruthless dictator that had previously been replaced by the new ruthless dictator. And the West then continued all the way up the Korean Peninsula. At this point, China was getting worried that the UN may just keep going. The US had sent this guy to lead the operation. After winning the Pacific Theater of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur's head was big, and his balls were bigger. He reassured President Truman that there was absolutely no way at all that the Chinese would ever get involved. Meanwhile, 500,000 Chinese troops were crossing into Korea. Nuke 'em. No. Nuke 'em. No. Ah, come on! You're fired. The US considered the nuclear option, but now that the Soviets also had the bomb, they didn't want to risk all-out global destruction. The communists pushed the West right back almost to the exact same spot they had all started from, and they ended up in a stalemate, where they remained until both sides finally agreed to work towards a peace settlement in 2018. Back in America, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected famed World War II General Eisenhower, who was really hard to draw. It's 1953. Hey, Stalin, how you doing? Oh, he's dead. He had a cerebral hemorrhage, and his reign of terror kind of came back to bite him in the ass, because he had imprisoned all of his best doctors, and those that were left were too terrified to treat him. The new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, called a meeting and said, "Hey guys, you know how Stalin was imprisoning and murdering us all for doing basically nothing? Yeah, he was kind of a jerk. I'm really not sure how this is news to you." Khrushchev went on a campaign of de-Stalinization. Statues of Stalin were taken down, Stalingrad was renamed, and Khrushchev announced that he wanted the Soviet people to be happy and would allow greater freedom in the Soviet Union. So how did that work out? Well, an uprising in East Germany was brutally suppressed, a revolution in Hungary was brutally suppressed, and demonstrations in Poland were brutally suppressed. Although he did finally allow some mild reforms. Back in the Soviet Union, he permitted more cultural expression, but then began banning stuff based on his own personal taste. Modern art looks like a child urinated on a canvas. Banned. Jazz music sounds like the feeling of needing to fart. Banned. Your poetry is really depressing. How could anyone in the Soviet Union be depressed? You're banned. Khrushchev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but not like that, or that, or that. Young people began enjoying a boring Western pop culture. Son, remove that disgusting imperialist apparel at once. Shut up, Dad. You can't tell me what to do. Well, would you look at that? Turns out he can tell me what to do. The West had initially liked the cut of Khrushchev's jib, but world events soon soured relations even more. The two sides were spying on each other a whole lot throughout the Cold War. The KGB had spies and informants in nearly every aspect of Western life and government, so much so that whenever the US tried to send spies into the Soviet Union, the KGB were usually ready to arrest them on the spot. Members of the Manhattan Project aided the Soviet Union in acquiring the bomb. Some American officials believed they were on the wrong side. I'll sell you 3 secrets for $5 million. Okay. Go ahead. The Allies are digging a tunnel under East Berlin to tap your communications. There's an American agent living at this address in Moscow, and sometimes, when I'm home alone, I like to put on my wife's dresses, sit in the corner, and cry for hours. Very interesting. In America, fear took hold during the Red Scare and the McCarthy trials. American values imploded as fear of communism collided with freedom of thought and expression, and communist kind of became a buzzword thrown around to describe anything people didn't like. Hollywood? Communist. Your next door neighbor's dog? Communist. When the grocery store cashier asks if you need a bag when you clearly can't carry 10 tubs of baconaise in your hands, communist. But one area in particular where the US had an edge over the Soviet Union was in its espionage technology. In particular, U-2 spy planes flew across Russia carrying out surveillance from the skies. There was a nasty incident in 1960 though, when one was shot down and Khrushchev was furious. Who the hell is this? He's a high-altitude weather enthusiast who flew off course. Okay, that sounds plausible. Wait a minute. Why does he have a gun and a poison needle? Because he's a very naughty high-altitude weather enthusiast. But much to America's concern, the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the space race. Everyone freaked out when Russia launched the world's first satellite, and then they actually sent a man into space. Even worse, there also appeared to be a missile gap in the Soviets' favor, and Khrushchev was so confident that he even allowed the US to set up a technology exhibit in Moscow, attended by a certain Vice President Richard Nixon. Check this out. We have color TV. Yes, but we've been to space and can obliterate you with our massive nuclear arsenal. Check out this vegetable peeler. Tensions increased further when both sides upgraded their atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs. And after West Germany was allowed to join NATO in 1955, Khrushchev set up the Defensive Warsaw Pact, strengthening the military ties between the Soviet Union and its satellite states. In 1960, Americans decided they wanted a new president who would be tough on communism, so they elected John F. Kennedy. The Soviet Union was advancing its technology, but it was also bleeding its coffers dry, and all of the money was going towards the military, not the people. Life under communism was still as hard as ever, and Berlin remained a thorn in the Soviet side. The contrast between the economically prosperous West and the struggling East was clearer day by day, and East Berliners were still able to freely travel to the West. Now, many of them were deciding to stay there. Millions defected to West Germany via West Berlin, causing Eastern factories to lose workers and taking a heavy toll on the economy. Soviet leaders decided this couldn't continue any longer. First, Khrushchev tried this: leave West Berlin, or else. Or else what? Or else, I'll be really mad at you. Yeah, no, we're gonna stay. Listen, man, West Berlin is ours, East Berlin is yours. That's just how it is. Kennedy felt pretty good about his show of American resolve. But wait a second, did you catch that? Let's replay it. Uh-oh, Kennedy just told Khrushchev that the USA wouldn't interfere in what the Soviets did with their section of Berlin. So Khrushchev came up with a new idea. We're gonna build a wall, and it's gonna be a big, beautiful wall, and it's gonna keep out all the Mexicans. No, sir, that's wrong, it's gonna keep in these Berliners. Oh, sorry, it's gonna keep in all the Mexicans. On August 13th, 1961, Berliners woke up to find their city divided into two, with barbed wire and guards blocking the border between East and West. Over time, a wall was constructed throughout the city. Torn apart. Thousands would risk their lives escaping over the wall, and hundreds would die trying. To the despair of Berliners, the West were unable to do anything about it, but the wall did put on full display the failure of the communist system. As Kennedy said, democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in. As part of the agreement between the two sides, US diplomats were still allowed to travel to East Berlin, but suddenly, East Berlin crossing guards started giving them the business, and Kennedy was like, nah. In October, the US rolled tanks up to the crossing point at Checkpoint Charlie as a show of strength. The Soviets did the same, and the two were in a standoff. They stayed like that for 16 hours, and the world braced for nuclear Armageddon. Thankfully, though, Kennedy called Khrushchev directly and was like, hey man, this is getting way too hot. How about you back your tanks up by an inch and we'll do the same? Sounds good. Okay, how about you back your tanks up by another inch and we'll follow suit? Alright, hey, you want to do another inch? And they both very slowly inched away from the apocalypse. Phew, let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. It wasn't.
Okay.
We got a second one. We'll discuss all of this afterwards. And of course, we got another ad. Wait, no, it's not an ad. It's fine.
This video was made possible
Hooray.
by Skillshare, an online learning community where you can learn just about anything.
It's a
Support my
sponsorship.
channel by signing up using the link below and get your first 2 months for free. For anyone who thinks recent US history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan, so he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending US threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The U.S. Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviets put its military into full combat readiness. The U.S. did the same, and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The U.S. finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the U.S. was set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they'd be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah, I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight. After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the north established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the south with Soviet support. The U.S. sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong. And over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops, and so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier. Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering throughout the Third World. And in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home by good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became this. This became this. And this became this. The new slogan that was taking root, make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable, and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home, and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as détente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed. Was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he wouldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair of
他是不是给我一对啊？
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford. Wow, you mean in America that people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. Ah, there it is. After the whole fiasco, Americans decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were concerned that US policy had become too soft, and in 1980, they decided they wanted a president who would be tough on communism, so they elected Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. And he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country, but a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric as the USA getting ready for war, and they were feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer. His philosophy differed a lot from previous Soviet leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that the arms race needed to end in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response: he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party, Solidarity, won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out.
Okay, I don't know what happened here.
Had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination. They traveled there in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious, and blocked travel to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling, and it wasn't stopping. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague, where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens, and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west by a train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force. Right, guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights: that damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted. The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through. East and West Berliners couldn't believe it and celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought to an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic, so believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia, and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a tank. So the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other words, you're no longer in charge. I am. Dude. So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics, and the world got along together forever after. Right, guys?
Okay, so can you guys summarize what happened?
After World War II, they kind of set up a blockade, the Russians, and then
What?
they
To
started
block what?
to
To
block
block of what?
to kind of just stop Western influence from reaching the Eastern Bloc, and then they began to set up nuclear weapons in Cuba.
Yeah.
And
What was the
then,
wall called?
the Iron Curtain or the Berlin Wall, or
All right. The Iron
and
Curtain,
then-
yes.
in Cuba, the missiles were removed after the Americans removed them from Turkey, and then in the proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam, they could.
Okay. Yes. Were there any more proxy wars?
I don't think so. Just those.
Here's a hint. Africa.
Oh, right. And then there's one in Africa, and also No, there was one in like Afghanistan, right?
Afghanistan, which was basically the Soviet Union trying to invade Afghanistan, and the US was backing, ironically, US was backing ISIS to keep the Soviets out.
Anyways, that happened, and then the space race happened, and then
Okay. Space race. What happened during the space race? Does anyone else know?
they wanted to. Okay.
Get the launch the first spacecraft.
What was the first thing? What was the first thing that happened? Who launched the first satellite in space?
The Soviet Union,
Who sent the first man in space?
the Americans.
Are you sure about that?
No. But the Americans sent the first person on the moon.
The Americans sent the first people to the moon, yes, but yeah, the Russians sent the first man Yuri Gagarin into space. They also sent the first dog into space.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was the name again? I think.
Laika.
Oh yeah. It's on my
Laika the dogo.
Yes.
on my big book of facts. Don't ask me why I have a book.
All right. So yeah, seems like you guys have remembered basically everything. Well, that's the end of class. See you guys later.
Bye. Adios.
Bye.